What if I told you that the world as we know it today might never have existed if not for a bold gamble taken by a bewildered Italian named Christopher Columbus? Or that a group of desperate souls, including religious zealots, runaway criminals, bankrupt aristocrats, and desperate peasants, would come together to forge a nation destined to reshape the very fabric of human history? Imagine a reality where the Americas remained untouched, a remote wilderness devoid of the dreams and ambitions that have since defined modern life, from Hollywood's glitz to the tantalizing taste of Coca-Cola. Friends, be sure to subscribe to my Quiet History channel, like, and leave a comment of at least 7 words. This is necessary for the channel to function. Share this video with others if you think it's important. Thank you. Picture this. You're in a time machine, whisked back 5 centuries to a world where the European empires reigned supreme, with Spanish galleons still the mightiest ships plowing through the oceans, and the riches of the Incan gold flowing solely into the vaults of Madrid. This was the landscape of the early 1500s, a realm brimming with complexity and diversity, yet utterly foreign to the present-day narratives. Before the first Europeans set foot on the shores of what would become America, the land was already home to a rich tapestry of life. Between 15 and 18 million souls inhabited the territory, each speaking countless languages, constructing vast cities, waging wars, forming alliances, and engaging in trade across thousands of miles. In the lush Mississippi Valley thrived the civilization of Cahokia, a city bustling with 20,000 residents, more than London at that time. Its inhabitants built monumental earthen pyramids towering as high as 10-story buildings, gazing up at the stars while cultivating corn across fields that stretched endlessly. Meanwhile, in the arid Southwest, the Pueblo peoples engineered multi-story adobe homes and developed intricate irrigation systems to thrive in a desert where rain fell but once a year. Up in the Northeast, the Iroquois forged the League of Five Nations, a democratic confederation that would later inspire the framers of the American Constitution. Yet, this intricate world was doomed, not for lack of strength or sophistication, but because a series of pivotal events in Europe during the 15th century sparked a chain reaction that would forever alter the destinies of 2 continents. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 blocked the traditional trade routes to the east, sending spice prices soaring tenfold. Pepper became more precious than gold, prompting European monarchs to seek new pathways to India. Spain, fresh off its 800-year-long Reconquista, the war to reclaim territory from the Moors, found itself flush with soldiers left idle and a royal treasury in dire straits. It was then that a visionary yet eccentric Genoese came forward with a radical proposition: to reach India by sailing westward. Columbus did not discover America. He wasn't even the first European to reach its shores. The Vikings accomplished that half a millennium earlier. However, Columbus achieved something of far greater significance. He forever bridged 2 worlds. His voyage in 1492 transformed the Atlantic Ocean from a formidable barrier into a bustling highway, facilitating the exchange of people, goods, ideas, plants, animals, and, tragically, diseases. Smallpox, measles, typhus, and plague, diseases to which Europeans possessed immunity, devastated Native American populations, wiping out 90% of them within a century. Entire civilizations vanished, leaving behind no trace but echoes of their existence. When English settlers arrived in Virginia in the early 17th century, they were met with abandoned fields and deserted villages. They mistakenly believed that God had cleared the land for them, unaware that merely a generation before It had thrived with life. But why did the English colonies ultimately become the bedrock of what would evolve into the United States? Surely they were not the first. Spanish settlers had established St. Augustine in Florida in 1565, a full 42 years prior to Jamestown. The French controlled vast territories across the Mississippi River and the Great Lakes, while the Dutch had purchased Manhattan for just 60 guilders. Yet, it was the English colonies that not only survived, but flourished, consuming all others in their wake. The secret lay in their approach to colonization. The Spanish sought golden souls to convert to Christianity, erecting missions and forts, but neglecting to build lasting settlements. The French established trading posts and alliances with Native Americans, but failed to bring families to lay roots. The Dutch fixated solely on profit. In contrast, the English colonists brought entire communities with them: wives, children, livestock, apple trees, and wheat seeds, along with their laws and cultural biases. They were not there simply to plunder. They aimed to settle and create a new life. Their first attempt, however, was a dismal failure. In 1585, Sir Walter Raleigh established a colony on Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. 115 hopeful souls, including women and children, disembarked with dreams of replicating their homeland across the ocean. 3 years later, when a supply ship finally returned, it found only empty houses and the cryptic word Croatoan carved into a tree. The colonists had vanished without a trace, leaving a mystery that endures to this day. Yet this initial setback only fueled the English crown's determination. In 1606, King James I signed the charter for the Virginia Company. This was not a royal expedition but a private venture, an investment opportunity created for profit. Investors hoped for quick returns, whether through gold like that found in Peru or a shortcut to China. Instead, they would receive something entirely unexpected. On May 14, 1607, 3 ships, the Susan Constant, the Godspeed, and the Discovery, anchored in the Chesapeake Bay. 104 individuals landed on a marshy peninsula, which they named Jamestown in honor of the king. The site was catastrophically ill-chosen. The stagnant marshes teemed with mosquitoes, the water was brackish, and the soil was poor. Most of the colonists were gentlemen who had never tilled the land in their lives, and the first winter proved devastating, claiming 2/3 of their number. Starvation, disease, and skirmishes with the Powhatan tribe brought them to the brink of collapse. Survivors resorted to eating their leather boots, rats, and, as rumors suggested, even cannibalism. Just when it seemed all hope was lost, a transformative event occurred. John Rolfe, one of the colonists, married Pocahontas, the daughter of the Powhatan chief, and introduced seeds of tobacco from the West Indies. This single act saved Virginia. The European fascination with tobacco skyrocketed. It was hailed as a cure-all, a remedy for ailments ranging from the plague to melancholy. Prices soared, and Virginia's land proved to be perfect for cultivation. Within a decade, the export of tobacco surged from nothing to 500,000 pounds, effectively laying the groundwork for what would become a flourishing economy. Thus, from the ashes of despair, a new chapter began, one that would set the stage for the rise of a nation that would come to dominate the world. What drove the colonists to abandon everything else, even the cultivation of food, to plant only tobacco? Did John Winthrop truly believe that the Puritans were on a divine mission, destined to be a shining city upon a hill? And what happens when radical ideas about freedom clash with the rigid doctrines of a theocratic society? These are just a few questions that invite you to delve into the fascinating and often tumultuous story of early American colonization. In the heart of Jamestown, a peculiar plant thrived amidst the turmoil of new beginnings: tobacco. This crop, the lifeblood of the settlement, overshadowed all else, including the essential cultivation of food. Streets were lined with it, and even the graveyard bore witness to its prominence as the colonists clung to their Bibles, convinced their endeavors were blessed by God. The fervent words of their leader, John Winthrop, reverberated across the Atlantic, declaring their mission: "We shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us." The Puritans believed they had entered into a sacred covenant with the Almighty. If they forged a righteous society, prosperity would follow. But failure, they feared, would lead them to a fate akin to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. However, the Puritan experiment was steeped in totalitarianism, intertwining church and state in a way that stifled dissent. Only church members could vote or hold office, and mandatory attendance at Sunday services was enforced under the threat of penalties. Acts of adultery were punishable by death, while blasphemy could result in having one's tongue burned with a hot iron. Even the celebration of Christmas was outlawed, deemed a remnant of Catholicism. Ironically, this theocratic tyranny laid the groundwork for the very seeds of American democracy. The Puritans placed a high value on literacy, insisting that everyone should read the Bible. By 1635, they had established the Boston Latin School, and 2 years later, Harvard College. By the end of the 17th century, literacy rates in New England surpassed those in England itself. Believing fervently in local governance, each community selected its elders. Hard work was seen as a virtue, while idleness was a sin. Success in business was regarded as a sign of divine favor. Yet not everyone subscribed to the Puritan vision. Roger Williams, a young minister, dared to challenge the prevailing norms. He argued that the government should not dictate religion, that Native Americans had rights to their own land, and that freedom of conscience was a God-given right for all individuals. In the harsh winter of 1636, Williams was banished from Massachusetts. He trekked for 14 weeks through snow-covered wilderness, surviving only with the help of the Native Americans. Eventually, he founded Providence, the first settlement in what would become Rhode Island, a place where complete religious freedom was legally recognized for the first time in the Western world. An even more radical figure was Anne Hutchinson. She claimed to receive divine revelations directly from God, asserting that priests were unnecessary and that salvation came through grace rather than through works. Her home in Boston became a gathering place, attracting as many as 80 influential merchants and community members. This was intolerable for the Puritan elders. Here was a woman teaching men, undermining the foundations of their theocracy. In 1638, she was put on trial for heresy. During the trial, she held her ground, deftly quoting the Bible better than her accusers. But when she proclaimed her ability to hear God's voice, her fate was sealed. Banished and excommunicated, she fled to Rhode Island and later to New Amsterdam, where, tragically, she and 6 of her children were killed by Native Americans in 1643. The Puritans interpreted this as divine retribution. While the Puritans were crafting their New Jerusalem in the north, a contrasting civilization flourished in the south. Maryland was established in 1634 as a sanctuary for Catholics. Carolina emerged in 1663 as a commercial venture for lordly proprietors. And Georgia, in 1732, was envisioned as a social experiment and a buffer against Spanish Florida. Yet all southern colonies shared one common thread: a plantation economy reliant on slave labor. By the middle of the 17th century, a system had formed that would define the American South for the next 200 years. At the top were the planters, owners of vast tracts of land and hundreds of slaves, living in opulent mansions like English aristocrats. Below them were small farmers, who either owned a few slaves or none at all, constantly burdened by debt and on the brink of ruin. At the very bottom were the slaves, legally considered property, stripped of all rights, even the right to their own lives. The cultivation of tobacco depleted the land within 3 to 4 years, compelling planters to seek new territories, often encroaching upon Native American lands. This led to a catastrophic conflict in 1676. Nathaniel Bacon, a young planter, ignited a rebellion against the Virginian governor, ostensibly over the governor's failure to protect frontier settlements from Native American attacks. However, the real struggle was between the old coastal elite and the new settlers of the interior. Bacon's forces burned Jamestown, forcing the governor to flee. But within a month, Bacon himself succumbed to dysentery, and the rebellion crumbled. The uprising alarmed the planters. They recognized the peril of an alliance between poor white settlers and black slaves. This coalition was too threatening to their interests, and they sought a simple yet brutal solution: the creation of a racial caste system. A white person, even the poorest, would always hold superiority over a black person. Laws grew increasingly severe. Slaves were prohibited from learning to read, assembling without permission, or bearing arms. Children born to enslaved women automatically became slaves, regardless of the father's race. Interracial marriages were banned under penalty of exile. Meanwhile, the middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, presented a stark contrast. They were the most diverse, tolerant, and cosmopolitan areas in the early American landscape. New York began as New Amsterdam, a Dutch trading colony. When the English seized it in 1664 without a shot fired, it was already a melting pot where 18 languages were spoken. The Dutch legacy of religious tolerance, entrepreneurial spirit, and words like Yankee and dollar enriched the cultural tapestry of the colony. Pennsylvania, however, stood out as the most intriguing of all. William Penn, the son of an admiral and a friend of the king, converted to Quakerism, embracing radical pacifism. Quakers were known for their refusal to remove their hats in the presence of authority, their informal manner of address, and their advocacy for women's rights to preach. Persecuted in England, Penn's father was owed a debt of £16,000 by King Charles II. Instead of repaying the debt in currency, the king granted Penn a vast tract of land in the New World. Penn named his colony a holy experiment. It promised full religious freedom, just treatment of Native Americans, no standing army, and a penal system focused on rehabilitation rather than punishment. In 1682, Penn traveled to America and entered into a treaty with Native Americans under a great elm in Shakamaxon, a deal said to be the only one never broken. Philadelphia blossomed into a city of brotherly love, rapidly becoming the largest city in the colonies within 50 years, surpassing both Boston and New York. By the early 18th century, the 13 colonies had transformed into distinct entities, bound only by their allegiance to the English crown. Each colony developed its own currency, laws, and militias. A Virginian planter had more in common with a sugar baron in the West Indies than with a merchant from Boston. A Quaker from Pennsylvania and a Puritan from Massachusetts eyed each other with suspicion and disdain. No one yet identified as an American. That term had yet to be coined. Yet, beneath the surface, something new and transformative was quietly taking shape. The vast Atlantic Ocean created not just a geographical divide, but a psychological one as well. Royal decrees took months to arrive and were often impractical in the New World. Colonists grew accustomed to resolving their own issues, setting the stage for a burgeoning sense of independence that would eventually ignite the flames of revolution. What if I told you that a single incident ignited a conflict that engulfed 3 continents? Imagine George Washington and Patrick Henry confronting the looming shadow of tyranny, all while the cries for liberty echoed through the streets of Boston. How did a seemingly insignificant tax on tea lead to a revolution that would change the course of history forever? Colonial assemblies, while formerly under the authority of governors, wielded incredible power. They controlled taxes and could easily withhold a governor's salary if he refused to compromise. Yet, the more significant issue was land. In Europe, land was a precious and scarce resource, often passed down through generations. In stark contrast, America was a land of endless possibilities. It was said that a French officer was killed in a treacherous act, rather than in honorable combat. This incident sparked a fire that would escalate into a global war. The conflict raged across 3 continents and all the oceans, as England and France battled for supremacy. In America, the fate of the continent hung in the balance. Would it be English and Protestant or French and Catholic? At first, the French appeared to have the upper hand. Their Native American allies were formidable warriors, and their commanders had an intimate knowledge of the terrain. However, England's powerful navy effectively cut off French colonies from reinforcements while providing the British with nearly limitless financial resources. The turning point came in September of 1759 at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham near Quebec. English General Wolfe stealthily ascended steep cliffs with his army and launched a surprise attack on the French positions at dawn. French commander Marquis de Montcalm chose to confront the British in the open field rather than wait behind the city walls. The battle lasted a mere 15 minutes, resulting in both commanders receiving fatal wounds. The British emerged victorious, and a year later, Montreal fell. French America effectively ceased to exist. The Treaty of Paris in 1763 marked a significant turning point, with England acquiring all of Canada and all French territories east of the Mississippi River. Spain, France's ally, handed over Florida. The British Empire in North America doubled in size. American colonists celebrated. The French threat that had loomed over them for a century and a half had dissipated. Now, nothing stood in their way as they sought to expand westward into the vast lands beyond the Appalachians. However, the perspective from London was markedly different. The war had cost £140 million, effectively doubling the national debt. With the need to maintain 10,000 soldiers in America to protect the newly acquired territories, it seemed reasonable that the colonists, who had fought for the war's outcome, should contribute to its costs. After all, an English farmer paid 26 times more in taxes than his American counterpart. The first sign of trouble came with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited settlement beyond the Appalachians. Ostensibly, this was to avert conflicts with Native Americans, but the true motive was to prevent colonists from spreading too far into the continent, where they would become difficult to control. For colonists, especially Virginia planters and land speculators like Washington, who had invested in Western lands, this was a crushing blow. But the real storm erupted with the Stamp Act of 1765. This law mandated that every legal document, newspaper, and even deck of playing cards required a special stamp for which citizens had to pay. This was the first direct tax imposed by Parliament on the colonies. Previously, colonial assemblies had the autonomy to set their own taxes. The backlash was immediate and explosive. "No taxation without representation" became the rallying cry of the colonists. If they were British subjects, they deserved the right to elect the representatives who would tax them. Yet there was not a single American sitting in Parliament. In Boston, enraged crowds descended upon the house of the tax collector, vandalizing property and expressing their fury. In New York, mobs hung and burned effigies of the tax collectors. Merchants initiated a boycott on British goods. Secret societies known as the Sons of Liberty sprang up across the colonies, intimidating anyone who dared to sell stamped paper. For the first time, the colonies began to act collectively. In October of 1765, the Stamp Act Congress convened in New York, representing 9 colonies. They sent a petition to the king, asserting their loyalty while simultaneously denying Parliament's right to levy taxes on them. Faced with pressure from English merchants who were losing money due to the boycott, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in March of 1766. The colonists rejoiced in their victory, but their triumph was short-lived. On the very same day, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act, asserting its right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The next attempt to impose taxes came in 1767 with the Townshend Acts, which placed duties on glass, paint, paper, and tea. These were external taxes on imports, rather than internal taxes like the Stamp Act. However, the colonists were not fooled. Protests erupted once again, and boycotts resumed. Women began refusing to drink tea, which became a symbol of tyranny. Instead, they brewed Liberty tea from local herbs. The Daughters of Liberty took up the task of producing homespun cloth instead of buying British textiles. Tensions escalated, particularly in Boston, where British troops were stationed. Clashes between soldiers and civilians became increasingly common. On March 5, 1770, a crowd began pelting British soldiers with snowballs and rocks. The soldiers opened fire, resulting in the deaths of 5 individuals. This tragic incident, soon dubbed the Boston Massacre by patriots, became a propaganda tool. Paul Revere immortalized the event in an engraving depicting British soldiers callously shooting defenseless citizens, regardless of the inaccuracies in the portrayal. The image seared itself into the collective consciousness of the colonies. Parliament again retreated, repealing all the Townshend duties except for a single tax on tea, a small symbolic gesture intended to affirm its authority to tax the colonies. For 3 years, relative calm returned. However, in 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, granting the East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. Though tea became cheaper, even with the tax, the principle was what mattered. Accepting the cheaper tea would mean acknowledging Parliament's right to impose taxes. In New York and Philadelphia, ships carrying tea were turned away. In Charleston, tea was unloaded but stored away in warehouses. But in Boston, Governor Hutchinson, whose family profited from the tea trade, insisted on unloading the shipments. On the evening of December 16, 1773, a group of Sons of Liberty, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and dumped 342 chests of tea into the water. This tea, worth an estimated 10,000 pounds, $1 million in today's money, floated away, representing defiance against British authority. The Boston Tea Party marked a point of no return. Up until then, Parliament could have retreated, preserving its dignity. Now it faced a direct challenge to its power. In 1774, Parliament responded with what the colonists labeled the Intolerable Acts. The port of Boston was closed until the dumped tea was paid for. Massachusetts' charter was annulled, and town meetings were banned. British troops were allowed to be quartered in private homes. Rather than isolating Massachusetts, these acts united the colonies. Newspapers declared that the fate of Boston was the fate of America. Virginia called for a day of fasting in solidarity. South Carolina sent rice to support the cause. In September of 1774, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, bringing together 56 delegates from 12 colonies, with Georgia notably absent. This remarkable gathering included towering figures such as George Washington and Patrick Henry from Virginia, as well as John and Samuel Adams from Massachusetts and John Jay from New York. While they still spoke of reconciliation with the Crown, they also organized the Continental Association, a total boycott of British goods, establishing committees in every town to oversee compliance. Effectively, this was a parallel government emerging in the colonies, where they agreed to stand together against oppression. What drove George Washington to risk everything on a treacherous night in December? How did Thomas Jefferson's lofty ideals clash with the grim reality of slavery and disenfranchisement? And why did a group of ragtag farmers, calling themselves Minutemen, pose such a threat to the might of the British Empire? These questions set the stage for a revolution that would forever alter the course of history. In the spring of 1775, tensions in the American colonies reached a boiling point. Farmers in Massachusetts honed their skills with muskets, forming a band of Minutemen ready to fight at a moment's notice. Meanwhile, British General Thomas Gage, stationed in Boston, received orders to disarm the rebellious colonists. On the night of April 18th, he dispatched 700 soldiers to Concord, where intelligence indicated a stockpile of weapons was stored. Yet the American patriots were vigilant and prepared. As the revolutionary fervor intensified, the words of Thomas Jefferson, "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," echoed through the colonies. Ironically penned by a slaveholder in a nation that condoned slavery, these words nonetheless contained the seeds of a powerful vision. They established a standard to which America would aspire for the next 2.5 centuries, even as the country grappled with deep-seated contradictions. But lofty ideals alone do not win wars. By the summer of 1776, the situation for the Americans had become dire. The British forces had landed 32,000 troops in New York, the largest military expedition of the 18th century. George Washington found himself at the helm of 20,000 poorly trained militia, struggling to defend the city. The Battle of Long Island in August turned disastrous, forcing the Americans into a chaotic retreat. The British could have obliterated Washington's army, but through a daring night maneuver across the East River, shrouded in fog, he managed to save his troops. The autumn of 1776 marked a bleak chapter in the Revolution. With the British firmly in control of New York, Washington's army dwindled as enlistments expired and soldiers returned home. By December, he was left with only 3,000 men, retreating through New Jersey as Congress fled in panic from Philadelphia to Baltimore. British General Cornwallis boasted that he would soon capture the elusive Washington, predicting the end of the rebellion by Christmas. Yet Washington understood that without a decisive victory, the revolution itself could perish. In the dead of night on December 25th, he executed a bold plan, leading 2,400 men across the ice-laden Delaware River. On the morning of December 26th, they launched a surprise attack on the Hessian garrison in Trenton, catching the German mercenaries off guard while they celebrated Christmas. The skirmish was swift. Within an hour, over 1,000 Hessians were captured, and the Americans suffered no casualties in battle. Only 2 men froze during the march. A week later, Washington achieved another victory at Princeton, reviving the hopes of the revolutionaries and drawing former militiamen back to the cause. The year 1777 brought renewed optimism with the pivotal victory at Saratoga, British General John Burgoyne, leading 8,000 troops from Canada, aimed to sever New England from the other colonies. However, American forces surrounded him in the dense woods of northern New York. After two significant battles where American troops proved they could stand toe-to-toe with their British counterparts, Burgoyne surrendered on October 17th. This victory altered the course of the war, prompting France, which had been secretly supplying arms, to openly join the fight. The French Navy began to challenge British dominance at sea, while financial and military aid poured into America. Spain and the Netherlands soon declared war on Britain, turning a local insurrection into a global conflict. Yet, the American army had to endure grim hardships, particularly during the winter at Valley Forge from 1777 to 1778. 11,000 soldiers camped just 20 miles from Philadelphia, where the British enjoyed warmth and comfort. The Americans faced a dire shortage of food, clothing, and proper footwear. The bloodied trails left by their bare feet in the snow told a harrowing tale. Unfortunately, 2,500 soldiers perished due to the bitter cold and disease. However, those who survived emerged as a cohesive fighting force, thanks to the rigorous training by Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer who drilled them relentlessly. The war dragged on for 3 more long years. The British shifted their focus southward, hoping to rally loyalists to their cause. They captured Savannah and Charleston and dealt crushing blows to the Americans at Camden. However, guerrilla warfare led by figures such as Francis Marion, known as the Swamp Fox, took a toll on the British forces. The battles at Kings Mountain and Cowpens demonstrated that American militias could effectively dismantle regular British troops. The decisive moment came in the autumn of 1881, as General Cornwallis fortified his position in Yorktown, Virginia, awaiting reinforcements from the sea. Washington executed a rapid march to bring his troops from New York. Meanwhile, the French fleet, commanded by Admiral de Grasse, effectively blockaded the Chesapeake Bay, cutting Cornwallis off from escape. 17,000 American and French soldiers besieged the 8,000 British troops. On October 19th, Cornwallis capitulated, and a British band played "The World Turned Upside Down" in a show of surrender. When news of Yorktown reached London, Prime Minister Lord North exclaimed, "My God, it's all over!" Although Britain still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah, and boasted a formidable navy, the spirit to continue the fight was broken. The war had cost Britain £100 million, yielding nothing but humiliation. On September 3, 1883, a peace treaty was signed in Paris, recognizing the independence of the United States of America. But what exactly constituted these United States? 13 independent republics, tenuously connected by the Articles of Confederation, more a league of friendship than a unified nation. Congress lacked the power to levy taxes, regulate trade, or enforce its decrees. It could only plead, beg, and persuade. Problems arose almost immediately. The army went months without pay, stirring discontent among the ranks. In March of 1883, officers in Newburgh were on the brink of mutiny. It was only the personal intervention of Washington, who donned spectacles to emphasize his own weariness and near blindness from service, that quelled the potential uprising. By June, enraged soldiers surrounded Congress in Philadelphia, demanding their back pay. The Congress fled to Princeton. The economy lay in shambles, with each state printing its own rapidly devalued currency. The term "not worth a continental" arose from the uselessness of the Continental Congress's money. States engaged in tariff wars against one another. New York imposed taxes on goods from New Jersey and Connecticut. Virginia and Maryland clashed over navigation rights on the Potomac River. In 1886, Shays' Rebellion erupted in Massachusetts, led by Daniel Shays, a veteran of the Revolution. Farmers facing imprisonment for unpaid debts closed courts and stormed the arsenal in Springfield. Although the rebellion was suppressed by the militia, it exposed the fragile state of the nation, inching perilously close to anarchy. George Washington foresaw dire consequences if a stronger governmental authority was not established. Alexander Hamilton, a brilliant young lawyer from New York, advocated for the creation of a robust national government. Meanwhile, James Madison, a slight and frail Virginian with a razor-sharp intellect, dedicated months to studying the history of all known republics, from Athens to Venice, searching for a successful formula that could be adapted to American needs. By May of 1887, the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia, ostensibly to revise the Articles of Confederation, but, in reality, to craft an entirely new government. The fate of the fledgling nation hung in the balance. What was the secret behind the closed shutters of Independence Hall during the sweltering Philadelphia summer? How did giants like Washington, Franklin, and Hamilton shape the course of American history? And what catastrophic consequences did the quest for expansion bring to the nation? Picture it. 55 delegates from every state except Rhode Island huddled together in Independence Hall, the air thick with tension and the weight of history. To guard their discussions from prying eyes, they closed the windows and shuttered the doors, despite the stifling heat. This assembly was not just any ordinary meeting. It was a gathering of the titans of American history. George Washington, presiding over the convention, lent an air of legitimacy to the proceedings simply by being there. Benjamin Franklin, at the venerable age of 81 and carried in on a palanquin due to his severe gout, eased the strain of heated debates with his trademark wit and wisdom. Alexander Hamilton, ever the orator, spoke at length, passionately advocating for a government modeled after the British system, complete with a president for life. Meanwhile, James Madison, often referred to as the father of the Constitution, spoke softly, yet his words commanded the utmost attention from his peers. The debates were fierce and fiery, mirroring the very essence of the nation they were forming. Yet, with the idea of expansion came a host of problems. Every new state that entered the Union disrupted the delicate balance between free and slave states in the Senate, a balance that would soon prove untenable. The Missouri Compromise of 1820 sought to address this issue, allowing Missouri to enter as a slave state while Maine joined as a free state, and establishing a line north of which slavery would be prohibited. Yet Thomas Jefferson, even in retirement, described this compromise as a fire bell in the night, a dire warning of the impending catastrophe. The year 1812 marked the onset of the Second War with Britain, which many Americans referred to as their second struggle for independence. A series of grievances fueled this conflict. British forces were forcibly recruiting American sailors, inciting Native American raids on the frontier, and blockading American trade with Europe. Young congressmen known as the War Hawks, led by Henry Clay, clamored for war and the annexation of Canada. However, the war proved to be a disastrous affair. Invasions of Canada faltered, and British troops famously set fire to Washington, D.C. in August of 1814, forcing President Madison and his administration to flee. Yet, American victories on Lake Erie and Lake Champlain turned the tide, culminating in Andrew Jackson's decisive triumph over the British at the Battle of New Orleans on January 8, 1815, resulting in 2,000 British casualties compared to just 71 American losses. Ironically, the peace treaty had already been signed 2 weeks earlier, but news had yet to reach the front lines. America concluded the war on a high note, solidifying its independence in the eyes of Britain, which would no longer regard the young nation as a rebellious colony. The aftermath of the war saw the decline of the Federalist Party, which had opposed the conflict and even hinted at secession in New England. A decade of relative tranquility followed, characterized by what was known as the Era of Good Feelings, a time of one-party rule and national unity. In 1823, the Monroe Doctrine boldly declared the Western Hemisphere closed to European colonization, a statement that, while backed by British naval power, reflected America's burgeoning sense of its role on the world stage. The 1820s ushered in a democratic revolution, as property requirements for voting were dismantled state by state. By 1828, nearly all white men had the right to vote in most places. The presidential election of 1824 became a rallying point for the masses, as Andrew Jackson received the most votes but lost in the House of Representatives to John Quincy Adams in what many called a corrupt bargain. Jackson's victory in 1828 heralded the dawn of Jacksonian democracy, a populist movement that favored the common man over the elite. His inauguration transformed into a raucous celebration as crowds surged into the White House, stomping in mud-caked boots on the sumptuous silk upholstery, a sight that horrified the aristocracy. Jackson governed like a populist dictator, wielding the veto power more than all his predecessors combined. He dismantled the national bank, viewing it as a tool of the elite, and implemented a patronage system, what he referred to as the spoils system, which replaced federal employees with his supporters. However, perhaps the darkest stain on his presidency came with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which forcibly displaced 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles from their ancestral lands in the southeast to what is now Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears. In 1838, during which 16,000 Cherokees were uprooted from their homes and driven west, resulted in the loss of 4,000 lives, a tragic chapter of genocide sanctioned by a democratically elected government. The 1830s and 40s were also a period of remarkable expansion and transformation. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, connected the Great Lakes to the Atlantic, establishing New York as the gateway to the West. Railroads began to crisscross the nation, expanding from 30 miles of track in 1830 to 30,000 miles by 1860. The Industrial Revolution revolutionized the North, with textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, employing thousands of young women from the countryside. Pittsburgh emerged as a steel manufacturing powerhouse, while New York City claimed its status as the financial capital of the nation. Immigration surged, with Irish fleeing the potato famine and Germans escaping political oppression. By 1860, 1 in every 7 Americans was born abroad. Meanwhile, the South charted a different course. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney in 1793 made cotton the lucrative king of the economy, ruling from the Carolinas to Texas. By 1860, cotton accounted for 60% of American exports, yet its cultivation was inextricably linked to the institution of slavery, which swelled from 700,000 enslaved individuals in 1790 to 4 million by 1860. This stark contrast forged 2 distinct societies within a single nation: the industrial, urban North, which thrived on free labor and welcomed immigrants, and the agrarian, rural South, which relied on enslaved labor and remained insular. While the North embraced the likes of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, the South indulged in the romantic novels of Sir Walter Scott. The North built schools and libraries, while the South enacted laws forbidding the education of enslaved people. Such disparities deepened the rift between the 2 regions, which became increasingly irreconcilable. The notion of manifest destiny, the belief that America was divinely ordained to expand from coast to coast seized the national imagination. Texas, populated by American settlers, declared its independence from Mexico in 1836. The Battle of the Alamo, where 189 Texan defenders perished defending the mission against thousands of Mexican troops, became emblematic of their struggle. A rallying cry of "Remember the Alamo" emerged. Though Texas won its independence, it was annexed by the United States in 1845, prompting Mexico to sever diplomatic ties. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, ignited tensions by sending troops to disputed territories, leading to a Mexican attack on an American patrol in May of 1846. Polk's inflammatory statement to Congress, claiming that Mexico has shed American blood on American soil, led to a declaration of war, although Congressman Abraham Lincoln demanded Polk clarify the precise location of this alleged bloodshed. The Mexican-American War became a showcase of American military prowess, with General Zachary Taylor achieving a resounding victory at Buena Vista, while General Winfield Scott landed in Veracruz and marched toward Mexico City, retracing the steps of Cortés. By September of 1847, the American flag flew over Chapultepec, and the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, resulted in Mexico ceding half of its territory to the United States, adding present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming, all for a sum of $15 million. The era of continental expansion was nearly complete, yet the acquisition of new territories reignited the contentious debate over slavery. The Wilmot Proviso, proposed in 1846, sought to ban slavery in any territory acquired from Mexico, setting the stage for further conflict and division. What if I told you that the fate of a nation hung on the balance of power between the North and the South, with towering figures like Abraham Lincoln and Robert E. Lee at the center of it all? How did the fierce struggle over slavery ignite a war that would redefine America's identity forever? And what were the turning points that led to the collapse of the Confederacy? The controversy surrounding slavery intensified dramatically in the years leading up to the Civil War. A proposed law aimed to ban slavery in all territories acquired from Mexico passed in the House of Representatives, where northern states held sway but failed in the Senate, which was equally represented by northern and southern states. The battle lines were firmly drawn, and the stakes were impossibly high. The Compromise of 1850 emerged as a last-ditch effort to keep the Union intact. California entered the Union as a free state, while the future of slavery in the newly formed territories of Utah and New Mexico would be determined by popular sovereignty. Although the slave trade was prohibited in Washington, D.C., the Fugitive Slave Act was reinforced, forcing northern citizens to assist in the capture of runaway slaves. This act galvanized the northern populace. Witnessing federal marshals apprehending black individuals on the streets of Boston and sending them back into bondage was unbearable for many. A covert network known as the Underground Railroad emerged, aiding thousands of enslaved people seeking freedom. As tensions escalated, the Confederates demanded the transfer of federal forts situated on their territory. Fort Sumter, located in Charleston Harbor, became the flashpoint that ignited the Civil War. President Lincoln dispatched supply ships, not reinforcements, but merely provisions for the beleaguered garrison. The Confederacy interpreted this as an act of aggression, and on April 12, 1861, at 4:30 in the morning, Confederate cannons roared to life, marking the official beginning of the Civil War. Despite its disadvantages, the North boasted significant advantages. A population of 22 million compared to the South's 9 million, of which 3.5 million were enslaved individuals. The North controlled 85% of the nation's industries and 2/3 of its railroads, alongside naval supremacy. However, the South had exceptional military leaders and a formidable commitment to defending their way of life. Both sides naively believed the conflict would be short-lived. Northern newspapers predicted swift victories, with calls to march on Richmond, the Confederate capital. In July 1861, 35,000 untrained Federal troops advanced towards the Confederate stronghold, only to encounter 20,000 seasoned soldiers at Bull Run. Initially, the North appeared to have the upper hand, but the arrival of General Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson turned the tide of the battle. The Federal troops fled in panic back to Washington, trampling curious spectators who had come to witness an easy victory. Recognizing the conflict would be a protracted struggle, Lincoln appointed George McClellan to command the newly formed Army of the Potomac. McClellan was a brilliant organizer, transforming a disordered crowd into a formidable fighting force, yet his fear of taking risks stymied decisive action. He spent months training and parading his troops, always overestimating the enemy's strength and hesitating to engage. Meanwhile, in the West, General Ulysses S. Grant demonstrated a more aggressive approach. In February 1862, he captured Forts Henry and Donelson, opening Tennessee for invasion. His uncompromising ultimatum, no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender, catapulted him to hero status. Newspapers hailed him as Unconditional Surrender Grant. However, Grant faced a near disaster at the Battle of Shiloh in April. The Confederates launched a surprise attack at dawn, catching the Federal Army off guard. The first day of fighting was catastrophic, with Federal forces retreating towards the river. Yet Grant refused to yield. "Retreat? No. In the morning I will attack," he declared. And he did, pushing the Confederates back despite suffering heavy losses, 23,000 casualties in just 2 days, more than all previous American wars combined. This conflict signaled to the nation that they had entered a new kind of warfare. In the Eastern Theater, McClellan finally advanced in the spring of 1862, landing 100,000 troops on the peninsula between the York and James Rivers to assault Richmond. Nevertheless, newly appointed General Robert E. Lee launched a counteroffensive during the 7 Days battles, repelling McClellan's forces. Lee quickly became a Southern icon, embodying the gallant knight fighting against overwhelming odds. He continued to press forward, defeating the Federals at the Second Battle of Bull Run in August. In September, he crossed into Maryland, hoping that a victory on Northern soil would compel Lincoln to seek peace or persuade Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy. However, a copy of his battle plans, wrapped around 3 cigars, was discovered by Union soldiers, giving McClellan the upper hand. On September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single-day battle in American history transpired at Antietam, resulting in 23,000 casualties. Although Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia, the battle was technically a stalemate. It represented a strategic victory for the North. This turning point made Britain and France hesitant to recognize the Confederacy. Lincoln seized the opportunity presented by Antietam to issue a proclamation that would transform the war's purpose. On September 22, 1862, he declared that all enslaved individuals in rebellious states would be freed as of January 1, 1863. The war to preserve the Union had now evolved into a war for the destruction of slavery. The proclamation was limited in scope. It did not free enslaved people in border states loyal to the Union or in areas already under Union control. Yet, it changed everything. 4 million enslaved individuals now understood that a Northern victory could mean their freedom. Hundreds of thousands escaped to Union lines, and 200,000 black soldiers, mostly former slaves, enlisted in the Union Army. 1863 marked a pivotal year in the conflict. In May, Lee achieved his greatest triumph at Chancellorsville, decisively defeating a Union army that was twice its size. However, he lost his best general, Stonewall Jackson, who was accidentally shot by his own troops. Determined to secure another victory, Lee once again invaded the North, seeking a decisive win. From July 1st to 3rd, 1863, the largest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere unfolded at Gettysburg, with 160,000 soldiers clashing among the hills and fields of Pennsylvania. Pickett's charge on the third day, where 15,000 Confederates advanced across a mile of open ground under withering fire, became the symbol of valiant hopelessness. Lee ultimately withdrew, having lost a third of his army and never again threatening the North. On the same day, July 4th, Grant captured Vicksburg after a grueling 6-week siege, securing the Mississippi River for the Union. The Confederacy was now split in two. "The Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea," Lincoln proclaimed. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln delivered a 2-minute address at the dedication of a cemetery in Gettysburg. In just 272 words, he redefined the American mission, declaring that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. The war had transformed into a struggle for the survival of democracy itself. In March of 1864, Lincoln appointed Grant as the commander of all Union armies. Grant's strategy was simple yet ruthless. Sherman would march on Atlanta, while Grant relentlessly pressed Lee in Virginia. There would be no breaks, no rest, as he aimed to exploit the North's superiority in manpower and resources to grind the Confederacy into submission. The spring campaign of 1864 was a brutal affair, with gruesome battles at Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor resulting in 50,000 Federal casualties within a month. Newspapers labeled him the Butcher, but Grant remained undeterred. He telegraphed Lincoln, "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer." Meanwhile, Sherman maneuvered toward Atlanta, the crucial Confederate supply hub. On September 2, 1864, Atlanta fell. Sherman signaled to Lincoln, "Atlanta is ours and fairly won." What drove Abraham Lincoln to victory over George McClellan in November? Did William Tecumseh Sherman really unleash a new kind of warfare on the South? And how did a single ship explosion spark a war that turned America into an empire? Let's dive into the tumultuous waters of American history, where battles were not only fought on the front lines, but also in the very fabric of society. The victory in the Civil War set the stage for Lincoln's re-election, as he faced McClellan, who campaigned on the promise of peace through negotiation. In stark contrast, Sherman introduced a revolutionary approach to warfare known as total war. His infamous march to the sea, stretching from Atlanta to Savannah, left a devastating scar across the land, ravaging everything within a 60-mile-wide path. "War is hell," Sherman proclaimed, vowing to make Georgia howl. His 60,000 troops subsisted off the land, systematically dismantling railroads, factories, and plantations. As they advanced, they liberated thousands of slaves who joined their ranks, further swelling the Union forces. By the spring of 1865, the Confederacy was in its death throes. Richmond fell on April 3rd, and General Robert E. Lee retreated westward with 28,000 starving, ragged soldiers, pursued relentlessly by Grant's 125,000 troops. The climactic moment arrived on April 9th, when Lee surrendered at the Wilmer McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse. Grant's generosity in allowing Confederate soldiers to return home and granting officers the right to keep their sidearms marked a poignant end to the hostilities. Just 5 days later, on Good Friday, Lincoln ventured to Ellis Island, which opened its doors in 1892, processing 5,000 immigrants a day. The Statue of Liberty, a gift from France in 1886, welcomed them with the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." Meanwhile, American cities erupted with growth. Chicago transformed from a modest 30,000 residents in 1850 to a staggering 1,700,000 by 1900. Skyscrapers reached for the sky, and the 10-story home insurance building, completed in 1885, was the first of its kind. By 1900, buildings of 20 stories had become commonplace. Electric streetcars, telephones, and electric lights revolutionized urban life. But beneath the glimmering surface lay a darker reality. Families crammed into single-room apartments and tenements, and political machines like Tammany Hall in New York wielded power through patronage and corruption. Boss Tweed notoriously pilfered $200 million from New York's treasury, mockingly asking, "What are you going to do about it?" In response to these pressing issues, the progressive movement emerged. Muckraking journalists exposed the rampant corruption and abuses of power. Ida Tarbell revealed the ruthless tactics of Standard Oil, while Upton Sinclair's harrowing account of the Chicago meatpacking industry in The Jungle shocked the nation. Photographer Jacob Riis documented the squalor of New York's slums, igniting public outrage and demands for reform. The Populist Party of the 1890s represented the interests of farmers and workers against the financial elite. Their candidate, William Jennings Bryan, delivered the iconic Cross of Gold speech in 1896 declaring, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." Although he lost the election, many of his ideas, such as income tax, direct election of senators, and railroad regulation, would later be enacted into law. The year 1898 marked a turning point, as America emerged as an imperial power. The Spanish-American War ignited over the plight of Cuba, where Spanish forces ruthlessly suppressed a rebellion. Sensationalist reporting by journalists like Hearst and Pulitzer fueled public fervor for military action. When the battleship Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, most likely due to an accidental fire, newspapers clamored with cries of, "Remember the Maine!" The conflict lasted just 4 months, during which Commodore Dewey obliterated the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay without suffering a single casualty. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders stormed San Juan Hill in Cuba, culminating in Spain's surrender. America emerged victorious, acquiring Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines, while Cuba became a protectorate. Yet the Philippines had no desire for American rule. Their struggle for independence ignited a brutal conflict from 1899 to 1902, resulting in the loss of 4,000 American lives and 200,000 Filipino lives. America resorted to using concentration camps and water torture. Mark Twain bitterly lamented, "We went to liberate, and we remained to conquer." Theodore Roosevelt, who ascended to the presidency after the assassination of McKinley in 1901, embodied a new era of American confidence. His philosophy, "Speak softly and carry a big stick," guided his foreign policy. He dispatched the Great White Fleet on a world tour to showcase American naval power, and orchestrated Panama's independence from Colombia to facilitate the construction of the canal. "I took the canal zone," he proudly announced. Completed in 1914, the Panama Canal drastically reduced the journey from New York to San Francisco from 13,000 miles to just 5,000. This strategic marvel allowed America to swiftly move its naval forces between oceans. Roosevelt was the first modern president to leverage federal power to regulate business. He dismantled the Northern Securities Railroad monopoly and established the FDA to ensure food safety. He preserved 230 million acres as national parks and forests. His Square Deal promised fairness between labor and capital, but the most significant reforms emerged during the Progressive era. The 16th Amendment in 1913 instituted an income tax, while the 17th established direct election of senators. The 18th Amendment ushered in prohibition, and the 19th granted women the right to vote. The Federal Reserve System was created to establish a central banking authority, and antitrust laws began dismantling monopolies. Child labor laws were enacted to protect the young. World War I catapulted America onto the global stage as a dominant power. When the war erupted in 1914, America initially proclaimed neutrality, yet American banks loaned billions to the Allies, and factories supplied them with arms. German U-boats sank American ships, escalating tensions. The Zimmerman telegram, which proposed a Mexican alliance against the United States, proved to be the final straw. On April 6, 1917, America entered the fray, with President Wilson declaring the need to make the world safe for democracy. 2 million American soldiers were deployed to France, their arrival turning the tide of the war. In battles like Belleau Wood, Château-Thierry, and the Argonne Forest, American troops proved they could stand shoulder to shoulder with the best European armies. Finally, on November 11, 1918, at 11 in the morning, the guns fell silent. The war claimed 116,000 American lives, but transformed America into a creditor nation, with Europe indebted to American banks to the tune of $10 billion. New York supplanted London as the financial capital of the world. Wilson journeyed to Paris armed with his 14 points, a vision for a fair peace devoid of annexations and reparations. However, European allies craved vengeance and reparations. The Treaty of Versailles became a contentious compromise, leaving many dissatisfied. Wilson secured his League of Nations, yet the Senate refused to ratify the treaty, leading America to retreat from global engagement. The Roaring Twenties ushered in an era of economic prosperity. The economy surged, with production soaring by 60% during the decade. Ford's assembly line made automobiles affordable for the masses. By 1929, Americans owned 23 million cars, averaging one for every 5 individuals. Radio, cinema, and jazz reshaped cultural landscapes, while women cut their hair short, raised hemlines, and enjoyed newfound freedoms alongside men. Yet beneath the glitzy surface lay deep-seated issues. Prohibition spawned organized crime, with Al Capone raking in $60 million annually from bootlegging operations. The Ku Klux Klan re-emerged, boasting 4 million members by 1924. Immigration laws of 1924 effectively barred newcomers from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia. Speculation on the stock market reached frenzied heights, with people buying shares on credit, convinced that prices would continue to soar indefinitely. As the market boomed, the stage was set for a reckoning. This tumultuous chapter of American history not only shaped the nation, but altered the world's landscape, revealing the complexities of progress, power, and the human spirit. What lessons can we take away from this era, and how do they resonate in our lives today? What happens when promises of wealth turn into utter despair? How did Franklin D. Roosevelt transform a nation plagued by economic ruin? And what role did the specter of communism play in shaping modern America? These questions lead us through a turbulent chapter in history, where dreams were shattered and resilience was forged. From 1921 to 1929, The stock market soared, quadrupling in value, while brokers assured everyone that wealth was within their reach. But on October 24, 1929, known as Black Thursday, the bubble burst. In just 1 week, the market lost an astonishing 30% of its value, wiping out $30 billion and sending shockwaves through the financial system. Banks collapsed, taking with them the hard-earned savings of countless individuals. By 1933, a staggering 1 in 4 Americans, around 13 million people, faced unemployment. The Great Depression emerged as an economic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions, with food lines stretching for blocks and Hoovervilles, makeshift shantytowns of cardboard and tin, sprang up in cities across the nation. Farmers, unable to meet their mortgage payments, lost the lands that had been cultivated by their families for generations. The Dust Bowl turned once fertile plains into barren deserts, forcing hundreds of thousands to migrate westward to California in search of a better life. Amid this turmoil, President Herbert Hoover, a staunch believer in minimal government intervention, seemed powerless to alleviate the suffering. The 1932 Bonus March brought 20,000 World War I veterans to the nation's capital, demanding early payment of their promised bonuses. The Army, armed with tanks and tear gas, violently dispersed the demonstrators, highlighting the government's inability to address the crisis. In the face of such despair, Franklin Delano Roosevelt emerged victorious in the 1932 elections, promising a New Deal for the American people. His inauguration signaled a stark departure from the failed League of Nations and the onset of a new era. However, the world was rapidly changing. The Soviet Union, once an ally, had become a formidable adversary, and the Iron Curtain descended across Europe. The Cold War began, with Truman Doctrine pledging to contain communism wherever it emerged. The Marshall Plan allocated an incredible $13 billion to rebuild Europe, ensuring it remained free from communist influence. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, prompting Truman to send American troops under the auspices of the United Nations. As General Douglas MacArthur approached the Chinese border, China entered the conflict, pushing American forces back. MacArthur's desire to deploy atomic bombs against China led to his dismissal by Truman for insubordination. The war ultimately ended in a stalemate in 1953 at the 38th parallel. The 50s ushered in a period of unprecedented prosperity. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act, commonly known as the GI Bill, provided veterans with access to free education and low-interest mortgages. Suburban growth exploded with Levittown on Long Island, where 17,000 identical homes were constructed in just 4 years. By 1960, more Americans lived in suburbs than in cities. The National Highway System, initiated by Eisenhower in 1956, spanned 41,000 miles and cost $35 billion, transforming the American landscape. The automobile culture flourished, giving rise to drive-in theaters, fast food restaurants, and shopping malls. McDonald's, founded in 1955, became a symbol of American standardization and efficiency. Yet beneath this shiny exterior, tension simmered. McCarthyism, fueled by a witch hunt for communists, poisoned the political atmosphere. Senator Joseph McCarthy accused countless individuals, from State Department officials to Hollywood stars, of communist infiltration. Lives and careers were ruined by baseless rumors and innuendo until McCarthy ultimately overreached by attacking the Army, leading to his condemnation by the Senate in 1954. As the civil rights movement began to gain momentum, the Supreme Court's landmark ruling in Brown v. Board of Education on May 17, 1954, declared that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. effectively overturning the separate but equal doctrine. On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks made a stand by refusing to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus. This act ignited a bus boycott led by a young minister, Martin Luther King Jr., lasting 381 days and culminating in the desegregation of public transportation. In 1957, the conflict over racial integration escalated in Little Rock, Arkansas, as the governor deployed the National Guard to prevent 9 black students from entering Central High School. In response, Eisenhower sent the 101st Airborne Division to protect the students, marking the first time federal troops were used to uphold the rights of black Americans since Reconstruction. The space race intensified when, on October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite, sending shockwaves through America. The realization that the Soviets could potentially launch nuclear missiles sent the U.S. into a frenzy. NASA was established in 1958, and education in mathematics and science became a national priority. The 60s began with a sense of hope, as John F. Kennedy, the charismatic and youthful first Catholic president, called for a new frontier in his inaugural address. "Ask not what your country can do for you," he urged. "Ask what you can do for your country." The Peace Corps sent young Americans abroad to assist developing nations, while Kennedy pledged to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. However, tensions continued to rise in the Cold War. The Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 ended in disgrace, and in August, the Soviets constructed the Berlin Wall. In October 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world to the brink of nuclear war, as Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev engaged in a high-stakes game of chicken. Ultimately, Khrushchev blinked, agreeing to remove missiles from Cuba in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade the island. The civil rights movement reached a crescendo during this period. Sit-ins, freedom rides, and marches filled the headlines. In Birmingham, Alabama, in 1963, Police Commissioner Bull Connor unleashed fire hoses and police dogs on peaceful child demonstrators, shocking the nation through televised images. On August 28, 250,000 people marched on Washington, where King delivered his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech at the Lincoln Memorial. Tragedy struck on November 22, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, but murdered by Jack Ruby before he could stand trial. The nation was left traumatized, and conspiracy theories proliferated. The Warren Commission concluded that Oswald acted alone, but doubts lingered to this day. Lyndon Johnson seized upon the sympathy surrounding Kennedy's death to enact the most ambitious social reform agenda since the New Deal. His Great Society and War on Poverty initiatives expanded Medicare and Medicaid, enhanced Social Security, funded education, and built affordable housing. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination, while the Voting Rights Act of 1965 secured voting rights for black citizens. However, the Vietnam War would ultimately undermine Johnson's presidency. What began as a commitment of advisors under Kennedy escalated to 500,000 troops by 1968. The Tet Offensive in January 1968, while a military defeat for the North Vietnamese, became a psychological victory, demonstrating that the war was far from over. Protests against the war divided the nation, with students burning draft cards and occupying university buildings. Hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" became the rallying cry of demonstrators. In 1968, a beleaguered Johnson chose not to seek re-election. That year would be remembered as an annus horribilis. On April 4th, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, igniting riots across the country. On June 5th, Robert Kennedy was killed in Los Angeles after winning the California primary. The Democratic National Convention in Chicago devolved into chaos, with police violently clashing with anti-war protesters. Richard Nixon emerged victorious, promising a return to law and order amidst the turmoil. What happens when a nation that once walked on the moon finds itself mired in a war that seems never ending? How does a country that celebrated victory in a space race grapple with the harsh realities of social division and political turmoil? And what does it mean when a president like George W. Bush declares "mission accomplished," only for the reality to tell a different story? Welcome to the tumultuous journey of America through the latter half of the 20th century and into the 21st. In Vietnam, the dream of peace with honor quickly unraveled into a nightmare of prolonged conflict. The war dragged on for 5 grueling years, further escalating with the invasions of Cambodia and Laos. The tragic events at Kent State University in May 1970, where National Guardsmen shot 4 students protesting the war, sent shockwaves across the nation. This was just one of many moments that highlighted the growing disillusionment with the government's narrative. In 1971, the Pentagon Papers revealed that the U.S. government had misled the public about the war for years. Finally, the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973 signaled the end of American involvement, but at an immense cost. 58,000 American lives lost. 2 years later, South Vietnam fell to communist forces, marking America's first significant defeat in a foreign conflict, an event whose scars would linger for decades. While the nation grappled with the fallout of war, a moment of triumph occurred on July 20th, 1969, when Neil Armstrong took a monumental step onto the lunar surface. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," he famously declared. For a brief moment, the nation united in pride, captivated as 600 million people around the world watched the historic event unfold on television. However, the euphoria of the 60s quickly gave way to the disillusionment of the 70s. Economic stagnation plagued the country, characterized by stagflation, a troubling combination of high inflation and unemployment. The OPEC oil embargo in 1973 quadrupled gas prices, leading to long lines at gas stations, a stark reminder of the energy crisis. Simultaneously, the American automobile industry struggled against the rising tide of Japanese imports, which offered more efficient vehicles. The Watergate scandal further eroded the public's trust in government. What began as a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters on June 17, 1972, spiraled into a political catastrophe that culminated in President Richard Nixon's resignation. The resulting skepticism left a deep imprint on American society. However, by the early 90s, a renewed sense of American supremacy seemed to be reaffirmed during the Gulf War. In 1991, after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, President George H.W. Bush assembled a coalition of 34 nations. The conflict concluded in a mere 100 hours, with only 148 American casualties. Smart bombs and footage resembling video games painted a sanitized picture of modern warfare. Yet, looming economic issues persisted. In 1992, Bill Clinton's campaign slogan, "It's the economy, stupid," resonated with voters, leading him to victory over the war hero George H.W. Bush. Clinton, a baby boomer and former governor of Arkansas who had avoided the Vietnam draft, brought a new dynamic to the presidency. Alongside him, First Lady Hillary Clinton, a lawyer and feminist, symbolized shifting gender roles in a changing America. The 90s became a decade of prosperity, with the emergence of the Internet revolution bringing about a new economic era. Unemployment dipped to 4%, and the stock market quadrupled in value. For the first time in 30 years, the federal budget showed a surplus, and America appeared untouchable on the global stage. However, beneath the surface lay unresolved issues that would soon erupt. On April 19, 1995, the Oklahoma City bombing claimed 168 lives and served as a grim reminder that terrorism could be homegrown. The scandal involving Monica Lewinsky led to Clinton's impeachment in December 1998 for lying under oath. Although the Senate acquitted him, the stain on his presidency remained. The contested elections of 2000 between Al Gore and George W. Bush marked another turning point. After weeks of recounting votes in Florida, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 to halt the recount, effectively awarding the presidency to Bush. Gore won the nationwide popular vote by 500,000 votes, yet the Electoral College decision left half the country feeling that the election had been stolen. The morning of September 11, 2001, marked a day of infamy. 19 hijackers from al-Qaeda crashed planes into the Twin Towers and the Pentagon, killing 2,977 people. The towers collapsed live on television, a shocking event that the nation had not experienced since Pearl Harbor. In the wake of this tragedy, President Bush declared a war on terror, which began with an invasion of Afghanistan in October. The Taliban regime fell within a week, but Osama bin Laden managed to escape into Pakistan. The mission, initially clear-cut, began to unravel as nation-building in a war-torn country proved far more challenging than securing a military victory. In March 2003, America invaded Iraq under the pretense that Saddam Hussein possessed weapons of mass destruction and had ties to al-Qaeda. Both claims were later proven false. On May 1st, Bush famously declared mission accomplished aboard an aircraft carrier, but the reality was that the true conflict had only just begun. A burgeoning insurgency, sectarian violence, and a staggering cost of 4,500 American lives and trillions of dollars persisted. The devastation continued with Hurricane Katrina in August 2005, which exposed the vulnerabilities of the nation. New Orleans lay submerged, with a death toll of 1,800 and a response from the government that was nothing short of catastrophic. Images of Americans stranded on rooftops shocked the world, casting the once great superpower in a light reminiscent of a developing nation. The financial crisis of 2008 nearly brought the global economy to its knees. Years of reckless lending and deregulation culminated in the collapse of major financial institutions like Lehman Brothers, AIG, Bear Stearns, and Merrill Lynch. The government intervened, bailing out banks with hundreds of billions of dollars, while Main Street suffered the consequences. Amid this chaos, Barack Obama, the first African-American president, took office on January 20, 2009, bringing promises of hope and change. His election seemed to represent a form of redemption for America's long history of racial injustice. However, divisions only deepened further, with the rise of the Tea Party movement in opposition to his presidency, fueled by unfounded conspiracy theories questioning his citizenship. Obama's tenure saw the implementation of health care reform through the Affordable Care Act, which provided insurance to 20 million Americans. He eventually ended the war in Iraq and ordered the operation that led to the death of Osama bin Laden in May 2011. Despite these achievements, partisan gridlock paralyzed the government, as Republicans pledged to make him a one-term president, blocking every initiative he proposed. The nation became increasingly polarized, with red states and blue states at odds, urban versus rural, educated versus uneducated. Social media created echo chambers where individuals only heard confirmation of their biases, leading to a broader distrust of facts and a blurring of the truth. In 2016, Donald Trump, a real estate mogul and reality TV star with no political background, won the presidency with a promise to make America great again. Despite losing the popular vote by 3 million, he secured victory in the Electoral College. His inauguration on January 20, 2017, was met with unprecedented protests, signaling a deep divide in the nation. Trump's presidency shattered established norms and democratic institutions. His frequent tweets, attacks on the press as the enemy of the people, and dismissals of officials investigating his administration became the new status quo. Special counsel Robert Mueller was appointed to investigate Russian interference in the 2016 election, resulting in charges against 34 individuals, yet Trump maintained his innocence. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in March 2020, exposed the deep fractures within American society. The nation, arguably the wealthiest in the world, struggled to mount an effective response, leading to the deaths of over 1 million Americans. The economy crashed, with unemployment soaring to 15%. Schools closed and businesses shuttered, prompting widespread distress. The police killing of George Floyd on May 25, 2020, ignited the largest racial protests seen in decades, uniting voices across cities in a cry for justice. The Black Lives Matter movement gained momentum as statues of Confederate leaders toppled, reflecting America's struggle to confront its past and present issues of racism. The elections on November 3, 2020, became a referendum on Trump's presidency. Joe Biden emerged victorious, winning by 7 million votes. Still, Trump refused to concede, alleging widespread voter fraud without evidence, a narrative that would further entrench divisions within the country. As America grapples with its complex history and uncertain future, the journey of a nation once celebrated for its triumphs is now marked by an ongoing battle for unity and identity. What caused a mob of supporters to storm the Capitol on January 6, 2021? How did an election that many believed was stolen lead to the chaos of that day? And what does it mean for the future of democracy in a nation torn apart? 5 lives were lost. The very fabric of democracy was hanging by a thread. When Joe Biden took office on January 20, 2021, he inherited a country deeply divided and profoundly scarred. The pandemic continued to rage, economies were still teetering, and half the nation believed the elections had been fraudulent. Trust in institutions was at an all-time low, and America seemed to be disintegrating. Yet, history teaches us that America has always been a land of division, a nation entrenched in crises, constantly teetering on the edge of catastrophe. From the Civil War to the Great Depression, from the tumult of Vietnam to the fallout of Watergate, America has weathered its darkest hours. Each generation has faced its own existential threats, convinced that the end was nigh, only to find that they were mistaken. The resilience of America lies not in its unity but in its remarkable ability to function amid division. The Constitution, despite its imperfections, established a system that bends but does not break. The peaceful transfer of power, the rule of law, and freedom of the press, these institutions have endured even under severe scrutiny and attack. Today, America still stands as one of the most powerful nations on earth. Its economy is still the largest in the world, its military unmatched, and its culture dominates globally. The dollar remains the world's reserve currency, while the English language acts as the lingua franca of global business. Icons like Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and Wall Street continue to be the epicenters of their respective realms. However, the challenges before us are undeniably real. China is on the rise, climate change is altering our planet, economic inequality is escalating, and democracy seems to be in retreat across the globe. Technology is upending traditional job markets, and artificial intelligence threatens to render many occupations obsolete. As we reflect on these issues, remember to like this video. Your support helps others discover these important stories. Until we meet again, let's embark on another journey through time, exploring how the past shapes our present and illuminates our path into the future. History never truly ends. It awaits to be retold once more.